On a Tuesday morning in late October of 1987, Delmar Tesdall stood in the kitchen doorway of his farmhouse in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched his daughter pack boxes. She was 17 years old, and she moved the way 17-year-olds move when they've already decided something. Fast, purposeful, not looking up. Her name was Nora. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's jaw, and she had been telling anyone who would listen for the better part of 2 years that she was going to college, was going to study agriculture, was going to come back and do things differently. Delmar had nodded every time she said it. He was a man who nodded at things he didn't fully believe and smiled at things he didn't fully understand. And he had been doing both for so long that it had become a kind of language between them, a language Nora had learned to read before she could read anything else. The boxes she was packing were not her boxes. They were his father's. Let me tell you about those boxes, because they are the reason this story exists. And if Nora had done what she planned to do with them, this story would have ended before it began. Delmar's father was a man named Virgil Tesdall, and Virgil had died in the spring of 1986 at the age of 81, in the same upstairs bedroom where he had been born, in a farmhouse that had stood on the same 480 acres in Hardin County since 1903. He had farmed that land for 62 years. He had farmed it in the Depression, when corn brought 8 cents a bushel and men drove their tractors into rivers rather than watch banks take them. He had farmed it through the war years, when everything metal was rationed and you fixed what you had because there was nothing new to buy. He had farmed it through the boom years of the 70s, when everyone around him was borrowing against tomorrow to buy more land today, and he had watched that boom become the crisis of the early 80s, with the same quiet expression he wore when he watched weather come in from the west. Not surprised, not satisfied, just watching. Virgil Tesdall had not been a man of many words, but he had been a man of many notebooks. That was what was in the boxes. 43 notebooks spanning from 1941 to 1985. Not diaries, not journals, records, yield records, soil records, weather records, field-by-field rotation schedules, hand-drawn maps of the farm with notes about what had grown, where, and why, and what had happened afterward. Rainfall totals by month, by year. Pest pressure by field. Prices received versus prices expected. There were pages that looked like accounting ledgers and pages that looked like botanical sketches, and pages that looked like arguments a man was having with himself in the middle of the night, all written in Virgil's careful, cramped hand. The letters pressed hard into the paper as though he wanted them to stay. Nora had been the one to find them, 3 weeks after the funeral, in the back of the grain room in the old barn. She had carried them to the house. She had stacked them in the corner of the spare bedroom, and then, for a year and a half, nobody had opened them. That was what she was packing when Delmar stood in the doorway. She was going to take them to the burn barrel behind the equipment shed, not out of cruelty, out of practicality. The spare bedroom needed to be cleared. There was no space. There was no time. There was a farm to run and a daughter to send to college, and 43 notebooks full of a dead man's handwriting were not going to help with any of that. She had the first box in her arms when she stopped. Later, she would not be able to explain exactly why she stopped. She would say that the top notebook had slid sideways, and she'd had to grab it to keep it from falling, and when she grabbed it, it fell open, and she read the first line on the page it opened to. She would say it was an accident. Delmar would say it was Virgil. Either way, she stopped. She set the box down on the kitchen table. She sat down in the chair her grandfather had always used, and she began to read. Delmar watched her from the doorway for a moment, then went to start the tractor. Let me tell you about what Nora found, because you need to understand the science before you can understand what she did with it. And you need to understand what she did with it before you can understand why half of Hardin County eventually followed her. The notebook she had opened was from 1962. The page it had fallen to was a record of the South Field. 40 acres of heavy clay soil that Virgil had always called the difficult 40 because it drained poorly and compacted easily, and had broken more equipment than any other piece of ground on the farm. The note read, in Virgil's hand, 3rd year of oats clover rotation on South Field. Corn yield following this rotation, 1961, 94 bushels per acre. Corn yield on North Field same year, continuous corn, 71 bushels per acre. Difference, not weather. Difference is what was in the ground before. Nora read that page. Then she read the page before it. Then she turned to the beginning of that notebook and read it through. Then she got up, went to the spare bedroom, and carried all 43 notebooks to the kitchen table. She was there when Delmar came in for lunch. She was there when he came in for supper. She ate without looking up. She had a legal pad beside her, and she was making notes in a handwriting that looked, Delmar would later say, remarkably like Virgil's. She was there at midnight. She was there at 4 a.m. When Delmar came down at 5:30 to start coffee, she was still at the table, but now there were columns of numbers on the legal pad and her finger was tracing something on a hand-drawn map of the farm from 1957, and she looked up at him with the expression of a person who has just understood something large. She said, "Dad," he was rotating. Not just corn and soybeans. He was rotating 6 crops, and he was tracking the yield on every field, every year, going back to 1941. And the fields where he rotated 6 crops consistently outperformed the fields where he rotated 2 crops by an average of, she looked at the legal pad, by an average of 22 bushels per acre on corn and 11 bushels per acre on beans. Over 44 years. Delmar poured his coffee. He said, "Your grandfather was a different kind of farmer." Nora said, "He was a right kind of farmer." Now let me tell you about what Hardin County, Iowa looked like in 1987, because it looked like every other corn and soybean county in the Midwest, and it had looked that way for so long that nobody thought it looked like anything at all. It just looked like farming. The corn-soybean rotation was not a decision anyone made. It was gravity. You planted corn one year, beans the next, corn the year after, beans the year after that, because that was what the equipment was designed for, because that was what the elevator bought, because that was what the extension service recommended, because that was what your father had done and his father before him, and if you asked anyone why they did it, they would look at you the way you look at someone who has just asked why the sun rises in the east. Because that's how it is. Because that's how it works. Because that's what you do. Delmar Tesdall was a good farmer. He was methodical and careful, and he took care of his equipment, and he paid his bills, and he loved his land the way a man loves something he has inherited and knows he will pass on. He had 480 acres in Hardin County, the same 480 acres Virgil had farmed, and he grew corn and soybeans on all of it in a 2-year rotation, because that was what you did. His yields were solid. His operation was not in trouble. He was not getting rich, but he was not going under, and in 1987 in Iowa, not going under felt like something worth protecting. He had simplified the rotation in 1972, the year he took over from Virgil. Virgil had been running oats and hay and clover alongside the corn and beans, and Delmar had looked at the complexity of it and the equipment it required and the markets that were shrinking for oats and hay, and he had made the practical decision. 2 crops, clean rotation, modern approach. He had never looked at the notebooks. Now his daughter had. Let me tell you about Nora Tesdall, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every other character this channel has ever told you about. And you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she did. Nora was 17 when she read those notebooks, and she would be 22 before any of this came to its conclusion, and in between those years she would do something that no woman in Hardin County had ever done, and very few people anywhere had thought to do, which was to take a dead man's 44 years of handwritten field records and turn them into a scientific argument that she then presented to her father, to her neighbors, to a county extension meeting, and eventually to a man named Hank Crowley, who was the largest cash grain buyer in 3 counties, and who laughed at her in front of 40 people, and who would, years later, drive to her farm and ask for her help. But that is the end of the story. Let me tell you the beginning. Nora left for Iowa State University in the fall of 1988, 1 year after she found the notebooks. She had spent that year reading them all the way through, twice, and cross-referencing Virgil's yield records against the county extension data she requested from the office in Iowa Falls, and building a spreadsheet on the family's first computer, a machine Delmar had bought reluctantly and used mostly to play solitaire, that compared field-by-field performance across Virgil's 6-crop rotation years against Delmar's 2-crop years on the same ground. She had been meticulous. She had been in the way of people who have found something they cannot stop thinking about, a little obsessive. The legal pads multiplied. The kitchen table became her office. Delmar ate most of his meals that year at the counter. What the spreadsheet showed was not subtle. On the difficult 40, the south field with the heavy clay soil, corn yields in the years following Virgil's 6-crop rotation averaged 91 bushels per acre. Corn yields in Delmar's 2-crop rotation years on the same ground averaged 74 bushels per acre. On the north field, lighter soil, better drainage, the gap was smaller but still present, 118 versus 109. Across the whole farm, averaged over the full data set, the yield advantage of the complex rotation was 14.3 bushels per acre on corn and 7.8 bushels per acre on soybeans. At 1987 prices, that was roughly $47 per acre per year in additional revenue. On 480 acres, every year. She brought this to Delmar in the spring of 1988, laid out on 4 sheets of paper with the numbers in columns and the sources cited at the bottom. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "These are your grandfather's numbers against mine." She said, "Yes." He said, "He was a different kind of farmer." She said, "The numbers aren't different, Dad. The numbers are the numbers." He set the papers down. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the south field, which was just beginning to show the first faint green of an early spring. He said, "I need to think about it." That was not a no. In the language Nora had grown up speaking with her father, it was about halfway between a maybe and a yes, and she knew it. She went to Iowa State that fall. At Iowa State, she found a professor named Dr. Annette Borgman, who taught soil science in the College of Agriculture, and who had spent 20 years studying the relationship between crop diversity, soil biology, and long-term yield stability. Dr. Borgman was not famous. She was not on television. She was a small, precise woman who wore the same cardigan in 3 different colors and who had a habit of writing equations on the whiteboard and then staring at them for so long that the class wondered if she'd forgotten they were there. She was, Nora would later say, the most important person she had ever met. Let me tell you about the science, because Nora learned it from Dr. Borgman, and it is the reason the numbers in Virgil's notebooks meant what they meant. A 2-crop corn-soybean rotation is simple, and it is profitable in the short term, and it is, from a biological standpoint, a slow disaster. Here is why. Corn and soybeans are both warm-season crops. They grow at the same time of year. They have similar root architectures. Corn roots go down 18 to 24 inches. Soybean roots go down 18 to 22 inches. They leave the soil bare for roughly the same portion of the year. They feed the soil microbiome in similar ways. When you grow corn and soybeans in alternation, year after year, you're feeding the same biological processes in the same soil at the same time of year in the same way, and you're doing nothing to feed the processes that work at different depths, different seasons, different biological rhythms. What Virgil had been doing, without knowing the science behind it, or perhaps knowing it in the way that 60 years of watching your ground teaches you things that no university had yet written down, was growing a rotation that included oats, which is a cool season crop that roots at 8 to 12 inches and grows in early spring, and red clover, which is a legume that fixes nitrogen and roots at 24 to 36 inches, and hay, which holds the soil through the winter and feeds the microbial populations that corn and soybeans do not. He had been, in Dr. Borgman's terminology, stacking biological functions across time and depth. He had been building soil while he farmed it. The yield data in the notebooks was not coincidence. It was the biological record of a man who understood something that the modern corn-soybean system had designed out of existence. Dr. Borgman looked at the spreadsheet Nora brought her in the second week of her freshman year. She looked at it for a long time. She said, "Where did you get this data?" Nora said, "My grandfather's notebooks." Dr. Borgman said, "How many years?" Nora said, 44. Dr. Borgman said, 44 years of field-level yield data from a single farm with consistent management records. Nora said, "Yes." Dr. Borgman said, "Do you understand what you're holding?" She did. She was beginning to. Now, let me tell you about Hank Crowley, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the laugh, and you need to understand the laugh before you can understand what it cost and what it eventually returned. Hank Crowley was 53 years old in 1991 when Nora came home from Iowa State for the summer after her junior year. He had been in the grain business in Hardin County for 30 years. He ran the largest independent elevator in the county, bought cash grain from 200 farms, and had opinions about farming that he delivered at the co-op counter with the confidence of a man who has never been wrong in front of anyone who could prove it. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built something real, who had watched markets and weather for 3 decades, who knew what worked and what didn't, and who had developed along the way the particular certainty of people who have been right often enough that they have stopped imagining they could be wrong. He held court every Tuesday morning at the co-op in Eldora. 8 or 10 farmers would be there, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups, talking about prices and weather and equipment, and Hank would stand at the counter and pronounce, Not rudely. He was not rude. He was avuncular and confident, and he told good stories, and he bought the coffee, and he had, over 30 years, become the kind of person a community organizes itself around without quite deciding to. Nora had known Hank Crowley her whole life. He had bought her grandfather's grain. He had bought her father's grain. He had watched her grow up and had always been kind to her in the absent way of men who are kind to children without paying them much attention. She was 21 years old, home for the summer, and she had a proposal. Let me tell you about what she brought to that Tuesday morning at the co-op, because she had not gone there by accident, and she had not gone there unprepared. She had spent the previous 8 months, the winter and spring of her junior year, working with Dr. Borgman on a formal analysis of Virgil's notebooks. They had digitized all 43 of them. They had run the yield data through statistical models that controlled for weather variation, price variation, and soil type. They had compared Virgil's rotation records against university trial data from Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. They had written it up in a 20-page document that Dr. Borgman had reviewed 3 times and that 2 of her colleagues in the agronomy department had read and called, in one case, the most compelling single-farm longitudinal data set I have seen in 20 years of research. Nora brought that document to the co-op on a Tuesday morning in June of 1991. She also brought a single sheet of paper with a simple table on it. 3 columns labeled 2-crop rotation, 6-crop rotation, and difference. The rows were labeled average corn yield, average bean yield, average gross revenue per acre, and revenue per acre over 20 years. The numbers in the difference column were not small. She walked in at 7:30 in the morning. There were 11 men at the counter, including her father, who was looking at his coffee cup. There was Hank Crowley, who was in the middle of a story about a combine header he had seen at a dealer show in Des Moines. She waited for a pause. She said, "Hank, I wonder if I could show you something." He turned. He smiled. He said, "Nora Tesdall, home from college. What are you studying up there? Remind me?" She said, "Agriculture, soil science. I've been doing an analysis of my grandfather's yield records, and I'd like to show you what I found." He said, "Sure, and held out his hand for the paper. She gave him the single sheet first. He looked at it. He looked at the columns. He looked at the numbers in the difference column. And then, and this is the moment Nora would remember for the rest of her life, he looked up at the men around him with a particular smile, the smile of a man who has just been handed a child's drawing and is deciding how to respond to it, and he said, "Honey, I've been buying grain in this county for 30 years. I've seen every rotation scheme there is. Oats and clover went out for a reason. The market doesn't want them. The equipment doesn't support them. And the farmers who tried to bring them back in the 70s lost money doing it." He handed the paper back to her. The room was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. The comfortable quiet of a room where everyone agrees. Then someone laughed. Not Hank. One of the men at the counter, a younger farmer named Wade Prescott, who grew 800 acres of corn and beans and drove a truck that cost more than most people's houses. He didn't laugh loudly. He just laughed. Nora looked at him. She looked at Hank. She said, "I have a 20-page analysis here with 44 years of field data, statistical controls for weather and price variation, and corroborating data from university trials in 3 states. I'm not talking about the oats market. I'm talking about what a diversified rotation does to soil biology and long-term yield. The numbers I'm showing you are from my grandfather's ground." The same ground my father farms now, the same ground I grew up on. I'm not guessing. I'm reading what the soil recorded." Hank said, pleasantly, "Nora, your grandfather was a fine farmer, but farming has changed. You can't run a modern operation on Depression-era methods." She said, "The soil hasn't changed." He said, "Leave the report. I'll look at it." He said it the way people say they'll look at something when they have no intention of looking at it. She left the report. She walked out to her truck. Her father came out 2 minutes later. They drove home in separate vehicles. At the kitchen table that evening, Delmar said, "You made your point." She said, "Nobody heard it." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I heard it. Plant your 100 acres, the south field and the east field. Do it your way." Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been handed permission to prove something you already knew was true? Not confidence, permission. There is a difference. Confidence is what you have inside. Permission is what someone else gives you when they have decided, quietly and without announcement, that you might be right. Delmar Tesdall was not a man who changed his mind loudly. He was a man who changed his mind the way the season changes, gradually, then completely, and only visible in retrospect. He had read the spreadsheet. He had listened to his daughter at that co-op counter. He had driven home and looked at the south field and thought about his father, who had pressed those numbers into those notebooks with such force that the impressions went through to the pages beneath. And he had decided. He did not say he believed her. He said, "Plant your 100 acres." It was the same thing. Nora planted the south field and the east field in the fall of 1991 and the spring of 1992. She planted oats in the early spring before the corn ground was ready to work. She planted red clover into the oats as a companion crop. She mapped the fields the way Virgil had mapped them, by hand, in a new notebook she bought at the hardware store in Eldora. She took soil samples at 12-inch depth increments and sent them to the university lab. She recorded everything. The first year was not dramatic. Oats yielded 68 bushels per acre on the south field, which was not spectacular but was not embarrassing. The clover established well. The soil samples showed elevated microbial activity in the clover-oat ground compared to the adjacent corn bean ground, which was what Dr. Borgman had predicted. Nobody noticed. Nobody drove by to look. The county went about its business. Hank Crowley, at the co-op that fall, mentioned to nobody in particular that the Testol girl was running some kind of experiment on the home place. He did not say it unkindly. He said it the way you mention weather. As a fact, neither good nor bad, just a thing that was happening. The second year was where it started. In 1993, Nora rotated the south field into corn following the oats-clover sequence. She had done exactly what Virgil's notebooks described. 2 years of oats and clover building the soil before the corn went in. The corn that came up on the south field that summer was the best corn Delmar Tesdall had seen on that ground in 20 years. He walked it in July and didn't say anything. He walked it again in August. He still didn't say anything. But he started walking the east field too, comparing it to the corn bean ground to the north, and the difference was visible from the road. Harvest that fall. The south field yielded 107 bushels per acre. The adjacent north field, same weather, same seed variety, corn bean rotation, yielded 79 bushels per acre. The east field yielded 112 bushels per acre. The adjacent ground yielded 81. 28 bushels per acre difference on the south field, 31 on the east. At 1993 corn prices, $2.50 per bushel. That was $70 per acre on the south field and $77.50 per acre on the east field. On 100 acres, that was $7,000 and $7,750 in additional gross revenue in a single harvest, on ground that everyone in the county had agreed was difficult. Delmar looked at the harvest numbers. He looked at them for a long time. He said, "That's not weather." Nora said, "No." He said, "That's what was in the ground before." She recognized the words. They were Virgil's words from the 1962 notebook. She had read them to her father 2 years ago. He had remembered them. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. That winter, people started talking. Not loudly, not at the co-op counter, in the quiet way that farming communities talk about things that disturb their assumptions, in driveways, at the elevator, over the phone on Sunday afternoons. The Testol girls' corn. Have you heard about the yields? Did you see the south field? That's the difficult 40. Has been since Virgil's time. Something's different over there. Hank Crowley heard the talk. He did not change his public position, but he started asking questions of the people who told him things, and the questions were more careful than his public position suggested. In the spring of 1994, Delmar came to Nora and said, "How much ground do you want?" She said, "All of it." He said, "Start with 200 acres. You decide the rotation." Let me tell you about the summer of 1995, because it is the year this story turned from a family matter into a county matter, and it is the year the drought came. The summer of 1995 was the driest summer in Hardin County since 1956. It did not come all at once. It came the way bad things come in farming. Gradually, each week a little drier than the last, each month's rainfall total a little further below average, until by July the corn in the county was showing heat stress, and by August the beans were firing from the bottom up, and by September everyone knew it was going to be a hard harvest. The county average corn yield in 1995 was 91 bushels per acre. That was down from a normal of 142. Some farms were worse. Wade Prescott, who farmed 800 acres of continuous corn bean rotation on light ground to the east of Eldora, came in at 74 bushels per acre. He had been looking at a normal year of roughly $280,000 in corn revenue. He ended up with $148,000. That is a difference of $132,000 in a single season, on a farm with a $400,000 operating loan. Nora's 200 acres of diversified rotation ground came in at 118 bushels per acre on corn. The oat ground, which had been harvested in July before the worst of the drought, came in at 71 bushels per acre. The hay ground held. The clover-seeded fields had better water infiltration than the bare soil corn bean ground. The organic matter that the rotation had been building for 3 years held moisture the way a sponge holds water, and the deeper root channels from the clover allowed what rain did fall to penetrate rather than run off. It was not magic. It was biology. It was exactly what Dr. Borgman had predicted, and exactly what Virgil's notebooks had recorded across 4 decades of Iowa weather. Nora's gross revenue per acre in 1995 was $312. The county average was $181. The difference was $131 per acre. On 200 acres, that was $26,000 $200 in additional revenue compared to the county average, in a drought year, on ground that had been called difficult. Delmar looked at the harvest numbers in October of 1995. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were right." He said it simply, not with drama, the way a farmer says something that has been true for a while and that he has finally run out of reasons not to say out loud. Nora looked at him across the kitchen table, the same table where she had sat with Virgil's notebooks 8 years earlier, the same table where she had eaten her meals while her father read the newspaper and her grandfather pressed words into paper in the upstairs bedroom. And she said, "Grandpa was right." Delmar nodded. He said, "All of it? You decide the rotation, all 480. Let me tell you about what happened at the Hardin County Farm Bureau meeting in November of 1995, because it is the moment this story moved from the Testol farm to the county, and it is the moment Hank Crowley came face to face with what he had laughed at 4 years earlier. The Farm Bureau meeting was held at the Community Center in Eldora on the second Thursday of November. It was a bad-tempered meeting, the way meetings are bad-tempered after a drought year, full of men who were worried about their operating loans and their land payments and their relationships with their bankers, and who needed somewhere to put the worry. The extension agent gave a presentation about drought-resistant seed varieties. A crop insurance representative talked about indemnity payments. There was coffee, and there were bars from somebody's wife, and there was the particular smell of a room full of men who work outdoors and are now indoors in November. Nora was there because her father was there. She sat in the second row with a folder on her lap. The extension agent, finishing his presentation, said, "Are there any other management practices people want to discuss? Any bright spots from this year's harvest?" Nora stood up. She was 25 years old. She was wearing a Carhartt jacket and a seed cap, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked like every other farmer in the room, except that she was 25 and she was a woman, and she was holding a folder. The room noticed all three of these things. She said, "I'd like to share some yield data from the Testol farm if anyone's interested." There was a pause. Then Hank Crowley, from the back of the room, said, "Let's hear it, Nora." His voice was neutral, not warm, not cold. The voice of a man who has been hearing things for 2 years and has decided it is time to hear them officially. She laid out the numbers. Not all of them. She had learned, in 4 years of college and 4 years of farming, that you give people the numbers they can hold, not all the numbers you have. She gave them 3. Her corn yield versus the county average versus the worst-performing farms in the drought year. She gave them the per-acre revenue comparison. She gave them the soil organic matter data from the university lab, showing the increase in her rotation ground over 3 years compared to the adjacent conventional ground. Then she said, "The rotation my grandfather ran on this ground from 1941 to 1972 produced an average yield advantage of 14.3 bushels per acre on corn over the 31 years of records I have. My father simplified to a 2-crop rotation in 1972. I began reintroducing the complex rotation in 1992. The yield data from 1993, 1994, and 1995 confirms what my grandfather's records show. In a normal year, the advantage is significant. In a drought year, it is the difference between a farm that survives and a farm that doesn't." The room was quiet. Then she said, "The lesson isn't that my grandfather's rotation is the only way to farm. The lesson is that any farm that grows only one thing, or only 2 things in the same sequence, year after year, is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail. The room stayed quiet. Hank Crowley, in the back, said nothing. After the meeting, in the parking lot, he came to her truck. He was alone. The parking lot was emptying out. Men climbing into pickups, exhaust rising in the cold November air. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and he looked at her for a moment. He said, "I've been hearing about your yields." She said, "I know." He said, "I'd like to understand the rotation better, if you're willing to explain it." She looked at him. She said, "You told me in 1991 that I couldn't run a modern operation on Depression-era methods." He said, "I remember." She said, "The soil doesn't read the sign on your elevator, Hank." He said nothing. She said, "Come out to the farm. I'll show you the notebooks. I'll show you the data. I'll show you the fields." She paused. "Bring a notebook of your own. You'll want to write some of this down." He came the following Saturday. He brought a yellow legal pad. He stayed 4 hours. Let me tell you about what happened in Hardin County over the next 10 years, because the story doesn't end in that parking lot, and it doesn't end on the Testol farm, and it doesn't end with Hank Crowley's legal pad. By 1997, 6 farms in the county were running modified versions of the Testol rotation. Not identical. Nora was not prescriptive about it, and she was clear with anyone who asked that the specific rotation had to fit the specific ground, and that the notebooks were not a recipe but a record of a man paying attention to his land. But the principle, diversify the rotation, add a cool season crop, add a legume, build the soil while you farm it, that principle was spreading. By 2000, it was 14 farms. By 2003, it was 31. The county extension office, which had been skeptical in 1991 and politely interested in 1995, invited Nora to present at the annual extension meeting in 2001. She did. She brought Virgil's notebooks. She brought the spreadsheet. She brought the soil data. She brought the 1995 drought numbers. She spoke for 40 minutes to a room of 120 farmers and extension agents, and, in the back row, 2 researchers from Iowa State who had heard about the data set and driven 3 hours to see it. Dr. Borgman was in that room. She had driven from Ames. She sat in the front row, and she did not say anything during the presentation, and afterward she came to Nora and said, "Your grandfather would have liked this room." Nora said, "He never would have come to a meeting like this." Dr. Borgman said, "No, but he would have liked knowing it happened." Hank Crowley was in that room too. He sat in the middle, not the back. He took notes on a yellow legal pad. He did not say anything during the presentation. Afterward, in the parking lot, he found Delmar Tesdall and said, "You've got a hell of a daughter." Delmar said, "I know it." Hank said, "I should have listened in 1991. Delmar said, "She knew it then." Hank said, "I know she did." That was the closest thing to an apology that ever passed between Hank Crowley and the Testol family. It was not much, but it was real, and in Hardin County, real is what counts. Let me tell you about Delmar Tesdall in the years that followed, because his arc is part of this story too, and it is quieter than Nora's arc, but it is not less important. Delmar had simplified the rotation in 1972 because he thought it was the practical thing to do. He had been 28 years old and newly responsible for 480 acres and a farm loan and a family, and the practical thing had seemed like the right thing, and for 20 years he had not had strong evidence that it wasn't. He was not a man who made decisions carelessly. He was a man who made decisions with the information he had, and for 20 years the information available to him, from the extension service, from the elevator, from the neighbors, from the market, had said that corn and beans was the modern way to farm. He had not read his father's notebooks. That was the thing he carried. He had not read them. They had been in the barn for 16 years after Virgil's death, and they had been in the spare bedroom for a year and a half after that. And he had not read them. He did not say this to Nora. He did not say it to anyone. But he thought about it. He thought about it the way you think about a door you didn't open, a road you didn't take, a conversation you didn't have with someone who is no longer there to have it with. In 2001, the year Nora gave her presentation at the extension meeting, Delmar was 57 years old. He had been farming the Testol ground for 30 years. He had watched his daughter transform it. He had watched the yields climb back toward the numbers his father had recorded in those notebooks, and then climb past them, because Nora had the science that Virgil had only had the intuition for, and the combination of the two was more powerful than either alone. He started reading the notebooks himself that winter, all 43 of them. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings after supper and read them the way you read something you should have read a long time ago. Slowly, carefully, with the particular attention of a person who understands that they are making up for lost time. He read them through once. Then he read them again. He made notes in the margins in pencil, small, careful notes, questions and observations, the way a student annotates a text. Nora found him at it one evening in February and sat down across from him, and they read together for an hour without speaking. Then Delmar said, "He knew, didn't he? He knew what he was doing." Nora said, "Yes." He said, "He just didn't have the words for it." She said, "He had the numbers for it. The numbers were the words." Delmar looked at the notebook in his hands. He said, "I should have read these." Nora said, "You read them now." That was all. That was enough. Let me tell you about the morning in March of 2004 when Nora's daughter, who was 8 years old and whose name was Clara, came to the kitchen table with a piece of paper covered in her careful second-grade handwriting and a question that stopped the room. Clara had been, from the time she could walk, the kind of child who follows adults around farms and asks questions about everything she sees. She had been following Nora since she could walk, and she'd been following Delmar since before that. And she had the particular education of a child raised on a working farm. She knew what soil smelled like after rain. She knew what healthy corn looked like in July and what stressed corn looked like. She knew the names of the cover crops and the rotation schedule and the reason the south field was called the difficult 40. She also had a question about hemp. She had been reading. This was a child who read everything, including, apparently, the agricultural publications that came to the farm. And she had found an article about industrial hemp as a rotation crop, and she had written down in her second-grade handwriting the following: fiber yield per acre, oil yield per acre, soil improvement properties of hemp root systems, states where it was legal to grow, states where it was being trialed, the name of a professor at the University of Kentucky who was studying it. She put the paper on the table in front of Nora at breakfast. Nora read it. She read it twice. She looked at her daughter, who was eating oatmeal and watching her with Virgil's dark, patient eyes. Nora said, "Where did you find this?" Clara said, "The farm magazine and the internet." Nora said, "Hemp is not legal to grow in Iowa yet." Clara said, "It will be. The article says 2018 at the latest." Nora looked at the paper again. She looked at the soil improvement properties section, which Clara had underlined. the hemp root system goes down 4 to 6 feet. It breaks up compaction. It adds organic matter. It is, in the terminology of the soil science Nora had spent 15 years studying, a deep-rooting biological tillage crop. She thought about the difficult 40. She thought about the clay subsoil at 24 inches that even Virgil's clover had never fully broken through. She thought about what a 4 to 6 foot root system would do to that layer. She thought about a girl at a kitchen table reading a notebook that had been in a barn for 16 years. She said, "Yes." Clara said, "Yes, what?" Nora said, "Yes, we'll look into it. Yes, we'll build the case. Yes, when it's legal, we'll try it." She paused. "Write down everything you find. Get a notebook, a good one." Clara got up from the table and went to find a notebook. Delmar, who had been sitting at the counter with his coffee, watching all of this, set his cup down. He said nothing. But he was smiling. He was smiling in the way a man smiles when he sees something complete itself. A circle closing, a pattern repeating, a thing that was lost being found again by someone who didn't know it was lost. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about a girl at a table and 43 notebooks and a burn barrel that never got used. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Clara's piece of paper, and it doesn't end with Delmar's smile, and it doesn't end on the Testol farm in Hardin County, Iowa, even though that is where it lived for the better part of 6 decades. Virgil Tesdall's 43 notebooks are in the front room of the farmhouse now, in a glass-fronted cabinet that Delmar built in 2005. They are not museum pieces. They are working documents. Nora consults them. Clara has read all of them twice, the second time with a highlighter and a notebook of her own. The university has digital copies. Dr. Borgman used them in a paper she published in 2003 in the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture, a paper that has been cited 47 times and that begins with the sentence, "The following analysis draws on 44 years of single-farm yield records maintained by a Hardin County, Iowa, farmer who had no formal training in agronomy and who understood, through observation alone, principles that the discipline would not formally articulate for another generation." Virgil Tesdall never knew that sentence existed. He was dead 17 years before it was written. But the notebooks were there. They had always been there. They had waited in the grain room, and then in the spare bedroom, and then on the kitchen table, and then in a burn barrel that a 17-year-old girl almost used, and they had waited because that is what patient things do. They wait. The Tesdall farm runs a 6-crop rotation now, the same rotation Virgil ran, updated with the science Nora brought home from Iowa State and the refinements she has made in 30 years of farming it. The south field, the difficult 40, yields 134 bushels per acre in a normal corn year. In 1972, the year Delmar simplified the rotation, it yielded 71. The difference is not weather. The difference is not seed technology, though that is part of it. The difference is what is in the ground, what has been built there year by year, by crops that root at different depths and fix nitrogen and hold water and feed the biological processes that make soil alive rather than merely dirt. Clara Tesdall planted her first hemp trial in 2019 on the south field, on the difficult 40. She was 23 years old. The root system went down 5 feet. The following corn crop yielded 141 bushels per acre. Nora planted sunflowers in a wheat county. They laughed. The drought came. The wheat died. The sunflowers lived. Virgil pressed numbers into paper for 44 years. Nobody read them. Then a girl almost burned them. Then she didn't. That's what happens when you almost throw away something that was built to outlast the people who built it, and the person who almost burned it, and the person who almost forgot to listen. The notebooks are still there.